What does a green future for Hawaii look like? Our state has committed to achieve 100% renewable energy, and we've already made a lot of progress. A smarter and more efficient grid is being developed. It'll help us safely and reliably integrate even more clean energy from many renewable sources, including rooftop solar. And as an option to rooftop solar, you may buy an interest in the electricity produced by a renewable energy project, like a solar or wind farm. With more clean energy coming into the grid, driving an electric vehicle makes more sense than ever. It's a great way to save money and go green. EV owners can charge their vehicles when rates are at their lowest. And EV charging stations are being added throughout the islands. The Hawaiian Electric companies support a green future for Hawaii to reduce our dependence on imported oil and your total energy bill. Find out more about clean, affordable, renewable energy at hawaiianelectric.com/ourvision.
Please welcome moderator Colton Ching as his panel discusses how federal decarbonization standards could impact Hawaii's clean energy efforts. This session is sponsored by Hawaiian Electric.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. While my panelists join me, thank you everyone for participating in this year's Hawaii Energy Conference. Really enjoyed the sessions that we've had thus far. We're going to kind of change things up a bit and do this panel a little bit different from what you might have seen so far today. I have a really incredible group of panelists here with me, and we're going to have sort of a no PowerPoint zone sort of panel discussion today to really leverage the knowledge and the expertise of the panelists that I have with me. And today we're going to talk about, or in this panel, we're going to talk about possible federal decarbonization standards and how could that change policies, plans, rules, and regulations in Hawaii. In the panel, we'll explore how the current discussion taking place in Washington, D.C. and internationally on decarbonization, such as creating a national clean energy standard, could impact things that we're already doing here in the islands. So again, really, we're going to take the next 45 minutes just having these five experts or four experts with me, kind of have an engaged discussion. I rest that you all had an opportunity to see the bios for each of our panelists, but with a quick introduction, in no importance of order. First, want to introduce Ed Sniffen. I think most of you know Ed, but Ed is the Deputy Director for Highways for the Hawaii Department of Transportation. Thank you, Ed, for joining us. Murray Clay is the President of Ulupono Initiative. Murray, thanks for joining. He gave me a big heart attack just before this because he just managed to get through his technical challenges at the very last second. Scott Glenn, who's the Chief Energy Officer for the state of Hawaii. Thank you, Scott, the world's busiest man, did make the time to join us in this panel today. So thank you, Scott. And then last but not least, Josh Sawislak. Josh may not be as well known to most of the audience, but Josh has an incredible background. He's the principal of Clio Strategies. But in addition to that work, Josh has served both in the Biden and the Obama administration, and recently served in the Biden-Harris transition team. Interestingly enough, working on climate and economic issues. So perfect background to today's discussion. So without further ado, oh gosh, I think I should introduce myself. I'm not an expert on this topic, but I do have the pleasure of joining these four experts here with me. For those of you who I haven't had a pleasure to meet, my name is Colton Ching. I'm a Senior Vice President at Hawaiian Electric. I have the pleasure and honor of working on a lot of the strategies and plans that we do for Hawaiian Electric and all the 5 islands that we serve. So this topic of decarbonization is something that's sort of very in front of mind for me as we think about how we plan out the electric system in Hawaii, not just for our local customer and state goals, but how do we be a part of this global effort to decarbonize the entire world economy. So without further ado, I just want to start off the discussion with a question to the panelists to kind of get the discussion going. In the meantime, for all of you that have joined us here today, please start putting together some questions, put it in the question sections, and myself and panelists will be kind of tracking them. And I want to fold in your questions to keep the discussion amongst the panelists lively and multidimensional. What are some of the various forms of decarbonization policies that are being considered at our federal government? And how do they compare with Hawaii's 100% RPS law and Hawaii's decarbonization law?
Well,
so I'll just throw it out there.
Maybe I could start off.
Go ahead, Scott.
Maybe I'll start at a really high level and maybe super wonky high level. But just to get into it, Hawaii has really two pillars that we look at for our decarbonization. One is the RPS, which handles the power sector. And then we also have the zero emission clean economy target, which is codified in chapter 225P of the Hawaii revised statutes. And I just want to note that throughout the morning, I've seen several presenters refer to Hawaii as having a carbon neutral goal. And if you take anything away from this panel and my comments today, it's that Hawaii does not have a carbon neutral goal. There's nothing in statute that says carbon neutral, net zero, or anything like that. Hawaii actually has a more ambitious goal, which is to be net negative or carbon negative. It's to sequester more than we emit, not to zero it out. And so when I hear folks say that we have a carbon neutral goal, it's like saying we have an 80% RPS. It's not really what we're aiming for. Our ambition is much higher than other states and many jurisdictions around the world. Very few places have a net negative emissions goal. And there's another key piece in that language as well, which I think is also helpful for us when we think about our RPS, which is our statute for emissions says we need to do it as quickly as practicable, but no later than 2045. And I really love that language because it says, get it done. Figure out how to do it and get it done. Don't wait for certain years to come around, but get to it. And as the economics change, as the technology changes, move on and figure out how we can accelerate progress. And you guys and KIUC have already been accelerating the RPS. We're ahead of schedule on that. And I think that's the same spirit we should be bringing to our emissions overall, which is how do we get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and how do we stop putting more into it? And maybe just, Josh, you probably are more familiar with the federal side of things, but that's definitely Hawaii's two pieces. And, I know the president on Earth Day announced several ambitious goals. I don't know, Josh, if maybe you could maybe speak on that. I could, but maybe defer to you since you've been involved on the federal side more.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. And aloha, it's great to be here. What the President Biden announced during his climate summit during Earth Week was a new nationally determined contribution for the United States under the Paris Agreement, which would reduce carbon emissions from the 2005 levels by 50 to 52%. And that is a very ambitious goal. And the administration has talked about 100% carbon-free electricity by 2035. So those are kind of the driving goals, and I think that lines up very well with what Hawaii is trying to do. And certainly, we will be leading by example. There are certainly some states that are better positioned with renewables, and then there are other states that haven't even gotten started. So I think we will be probably one of the most aggressive of the not as easy states, if you think about it that way.
It's a great start, folks. Murray, Ed, any thoughts about national versus Hawaii? Any contrasts in comparison?
Well, I'd say at a very high level, I feel like the RPS that we have in Hawaii is already kind of a higher standard. When you talk about clean energy standards, oftentimes they allow things in like natural gas, nuclear, even coal-based power, as long as it has carbon sequestration. and capture. So I think that our renewable standard in general is a bit higher standard than kind of the general purpose clean energy standard. And I guess I would also point out that when the Obama administration proposed a clean energy standard, that they actually, the version that went to the Senate actually exempted Hawaii and Alaska. So it's not even clear if a federal decarbonization standard or clean energy standard was passed, if it would even apply to Hawaii necessarily.
Totally agree. And looking at the priorities of this administration and Hawaii itself, and looking at our alignments overall, knowing that our RPS is much more stringent and a lot better than the federal side is a really good thing. From our perspective, it's always good for Hawaii to lead in certain areas to ensure that more funding comes here and more states can follow.
Colton, let me just weigh in on Murray's comment, because I think that's an important one.
Sure.
As to kind of where the administration is going, and let me do the disclosure that while I spent 4 months at the beginning helping the Biden administration get started, I am not in the Biden administration now, so I don't represent them. But my guess is that in a new clean energy standard that the administration has been talking to the Hill about, that this would be a holistic nationwide approach that will include Alaska and Hawaii. Obviously, that's going to make it more complicated to do, probably less so with Hawaii than with Alaska. But I think we have to look at this really as a national program. But I do agree with Murray that we have to be flexible, because we want to get to the goal. The problem we're trying to solve is carbon. And I think there are a lot of folks out there who may be trying to solve other problems using this as a way to get there. And I think we want to be careful about that, because there are things that we could do that make it very hard for us to win. And there are certainly types of clean energy that have less potential externalities. And we want to think about that, but we also want to understand that we really have to we have to decarbonize. I mean, we're at, I can't remember what the measurement was, but recently 420, 425 up on the mountain. And, those are numbers we have not seen in 6 million years.
Maybe I could put some numbers down for Hawaii. The Department of Health does a greenhouse gas inventory for the state. We're at about 20 million metric tons a year as of 2017 numbers. That's our most current inventory. And, there's disagreement on, what gets counted and what doesn't, but Hawaii follows the international protocol as modified by the EPA. So that's our approach. And actually for folks who are following this at the PUC, they're at a very cutting edge aspect as well on greenhouse gas accounting, because Hawaii uses a production-based accounting method, but the PUC has to look at life cycle emissions in their decision making. And it's really hard to marry those two things up. That's very cutting-edge policy right now. And everywhere is struggling with that. But from our production-based accounting system, we're 20 million metric tons. About 86% of that is energy related. So 13 to 14% is agriculture, land use, and other stuff. Setting that aside on the energy piece, you can break that 86% up roughly into two equal buckets, power and transportation, with transportation being slightly more than power. And if you look at our RPS, that's tackling the power side, especially with the PIM that Commissioner Potter was just talking about. So now we've got an RPS in statute and an incentive to run on the power side. And I think a lot of the really cutting edge work that Murray and Ed are working on right now is the transportation piece, the electrification of transportation. And kind of what that means from an emission accounting point of view is we're moving transportation emissions from the transportation bucket over to the power bucket. And then we're turning those emissions into renewable energy and eliminating them from the accounting overall. And that's important, really powerful work that has to be done on the ground here in the state.
Yeah, just jumping onto what Scott was talking about. We found that it's a lot easier to make electricity renewable than it is liquid fuel. So there are biofuels out there, but they're very expensive and they still have emissions. So the strategy is just as Scott was saying, to electrify transportation. We'll make that electricity as renewable and zero emission as possible. So that is the path forward. And there is some encouraging news on that front. Even in Hawaii, in the midst of the pandemic, over the last year, EVs have grown about 24, maybe even 25%. That's during a pandemic, during a recession. People are still getting EVs, whereas gasoline and diesel vehicles have been kind of flat. So we do see people in Hawaii really rising to that challenge.
And also, Murray, I think as we get beyond about the 5-year time frame, we can start looking at things like hydrogen fuel cell and other technologies that I think will help us drive that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Green hydrogen is perfectly valid, but it's just expensive right now. And I think what you said is right, Josh. I've heard 5 to 10 years probably before green hydrogen comes in at a price that makes sense as well, especially for long haul type of applications.
Totally agree. And electrification is a technology that's available and running now. So we might as well jump on it, especially given the administration's prioritization of it and electrification of transportation systems. So it's a perfect push for us. And to make sure that we make it easier for our residents here, we're trying to, from the state perspective, we're trying to lead to make sure that we start transforming our fleets as well and transforming where electrification is available in the system, make it easier for everybody to get over those humps of electrifying their own personal vehicles.
And one advantage Hawaii has in electrification is that the duty cycle, the average trip length, is shorter than in many other states. So you actually don't have, a lot of people can charge at home, and the public infrastructure is important, but not as critical as it is in, let's say, Western states in the mainland where the drive are a lot longer.
Agreed, except not in most people's minds. Range anxiety is still range anxiety, no matter where you live. So just us jumping in to ensure that we take care of those barriers for them prior to them making those decisions, it helps out everybody.
So this is great, right? This is the very kind of discussion that I was hoping to get from folks. We're starting to get some questions from the audience, but before I jump into them, I just want to go back to something that Scott Glenn commented on when he gave some facts about Hawaii. So one of the things that I've learned recently that makes Hawaii different, just amongst the thousands of ways that Hawaii is different from the rest of the country, is that when you look at carbon emissions, as Scott mentioned, the two primary sources are stationary electricity production, electricity use sector. The other is transportation, which encompasses a number of types of transportation. But we don't really have a third sector like you see in many other states where you have carbon emissions, a significant amount of carbon emissions coming from buildings and industries. We do have some of it, but in Hawaii, that slice of the pie is much smaller. What are you guys' thoughts about that difference being, perhaps an advantage or an opportunity for Hawaii? How should we be thinking about our approach to decarbonization given that difference?
I'd see it as an advantage. We have some big disadvantages that this helps offset in a way. When we talk about decarbonizing the grid and on the continent, and I think Josh alluded to this a little bit, all the other states have the continental grid to fall back on. And you can build a solar plant in Nevada and it can count for California's RPS. And Hawaii doesn't have that option. Each island stands alone, moving to 100% RPS. And as we think about decarbonization for the whole economy, we're going to have to do that for each island. Contrast that with, say, Pennsylvania, where they have a very heavy industrial emissions profile. They're going to need something like green hydrogen or some other type of renewable technology that's more robust than electricity in order to swap out the energy they need to make steel and to do that heavy industry. That's their challenge, not ours, thankfully, but ours is also, our challenge is hard too, which is each of our islands needs to be cared for in their own way.
Yeah, good point. Murray, were you gonna add?
Yeah, while we're talking about positives and negatives, I mean, this may be obvious, but on the positive side, we've got phenomenal renewable energy resources in Hawaii. We've got, if you look at, our position on the globe, true, we're isolated, true, we're not connected to other grids, but our solar and wind is better than virtually almost anywhere on the mainland. There's a few places on the wind side maybe, but not solar. We're kind of the best in the US because of our position, relative to the equator. And we've got good geothermal on the Big Island. So we've got very rich assets on the renewable energy side. And that, to get into Ed's world on the shorter commutes kind of helps on the transportation side. So I think those advantages probably overall outweigh the disadvantages. But what Scott was saying about having a grid that's not backed up by a larger grid is definitely really.
So go ahead, Josh.
I was just going to say, in addition, one last thing, which is, a negative that's actually a positive when we think about this, which is, we're paying a higher kilowatt rate than anybody else in the country. So the ability to actually get that investment, because that number is already there. I mean, yes, we would like to bring it down, but we also are not talking about a place, where it's 10 cents a kilowatt hour.
Right. The steel for oil concept, right?
Yeah.
Great point. On this topic of perhaps challenges and areas of economy that's hard to decarbonize, one area that I see as being a tough challenge for all of us to work on is how do you reduce, if not eliminate, carbon from certain sectors of the transportation, right? Marine and aviation in particular. One, because of technology. Two, just because, like many parts of transportation, there's no one or handful of organizations or companies or even governments that have that responsibility that can make and implement a change. Some of your thoughts based upon what you've learned in Hawaii as well as what you're seeing globally?
Well, Colton, I'll offer that we're going to make inter-island flying your headache very soon. I think the electrification of inter-island flight is around the corner. We're seeing more and more. We just had a symposium a few weeks ago on this, and hearing from OEMs and Mokulele and others that they have a 5-year business plan to start flying electric planes among the islands, and that's coming soon. The long haul flights, though, is much harder. Sustainable aviation fuel and hydrogen and fuel cells, that's a harder nut to crack. And I think there's some folks here doing some innovative work on that, waste to jet fuel, direct air capture to jet fuel, which will be really key pieces to us achieving not only our energy goals, but also our decarbonization and negative goals. If we can get to the point where we can pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and put it to use, then we're well on our way to a very sustainable, clean energy economy.
And I think the marine sector is one where we're probably going to benefit from the fact that some of these technologies require big stuff to do them, but also the carbon neutral liquid fuel. Again, if you're trying stuff out, if you're trying to figure it out, you're doing that in a ship than you're doing it in a plane. And so the failure rate is not as sensitive. And so I think there's some opportunities to do some great learning and some experimental work there, because I think we have to get there.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Josh. If we can shift to questions that we're getting a ton of questions from the audience. I'm going to kind of combine questions together in the interest of time. The first one I think is more for Ed and Scott around, besides important measures to convert the state's fleets of vehicles to electric vehicles, what else is the state doing, DOT, State Energy Office, or state at large, to electrify the transportation sector?
Ed, do you want to go first on the work you've been doing?
No, please.
Well, Ed's been going gangbusters. So, during COVID, actually right before COVID started, Ed took the lead at DOT on putting together a really innovative procurement method to use sustainability as a service to basically lease EVs and the charging stations, which is a really key piece because the charging stations have been the biggest choke point for us. And so, I feel like I'm speaking for you, Ed, but.
I just jumped in. For this contract, we put it in place because we talk about barriers all the time to electrification. Private side, the barriers have always been cost and and range anxiety. On the state side, it's always been contracting. When we start looking at changing out our fleet, I think Scott knows better than I, but our state system, our state agencies have about 2,000 vehicles that are light duty that could potentially be electrified with the technologies that are available. But the barrier to that is when we converted 4 vehicles in 2019, we paid 50 to 60 grand per vehicle. So that means for my 300 light duty vehicles that I have on my system, it would be absolutely cost prohibitive for me to change those out in the next 4 or 5 years. So we started looking at other options. We looked at a leasing option at one point, but found out that manufacturers had a hard time giving us a good price on it. It'll cost us about $800 a month just to lease, about 10 grand a year per vehicle. And that's for short-term leases. So we looked at these other opportunities. Our staff went out to different energy conferences and found that other jurisdictions were looking at purchasing the service of electric vehicles. And in that service, we wanted to include the charging stations and potential charging infrastructure like PVs and the like to ensure that we could push forward on electrifying our system sooner rather than later. For us, we used that contract to change out 44 of our vehicles, including one from Energy Office, to make sure we start electrifying our system very quickly. There was no other way that I would be able to change out 44 vehicles in 1 year, other than this type of contract, because it doesn't require any upfront capital. We just pay for the service per mile monthly. So overall, those 44 vehicles are coming out to about $300,000 per year over 10 years. And in that time frame, because the maintenance is part of that contract, I'm saving $125,000 on the vehicles I would have maintained anyway. And I'm not even throwing in the fuel costs that's been eliminated. So overall, it's a net savings for the state, and it's a net benefit when we start talking about emissions.
Yeah, that's a great success story. Scott, you were going to continue?
Yeah, what I didn't mention among all the other great things about that is that any state agency or county agency could participate in this. And we've actually offered this contract model up to the federal government, to DOE in the White House, when they've been talking about electrifying the postal fleets or doing some type of, federal EV procurement, that they could also model in a way for states and local governments to take advantage of the federal contracting mechanism.
Absolutely. And this contract allows us to take any technology that's available. So we're working with counties to see if we can change out their buses, electrify their bus systems right now. We're talking to DOE now to potentially look at yellow buses as well. So looking at just the opportunities available to us, fully understanding one of the biggest advantages is the contract's already available. You don't have to go through procurement. You already have a contract that doesn't require any upfront capital. And when we start changing out school bus fleets, that could be extremely expensive with that upfront capital requirement. So hopefully we made it easy for everybody to try and convert, because for me, the 44 vehicles that we changed out was important. But the 44 charging stations that we put in on our system, on our state charging system, was even more important. And as we go, we don't need 2,000 electric charging stations in our state fleet, in our state base yards. But we could potentially start pushing it onto the system for public use as well. So that's the potentials that we're trying to push towards.
So
maybe,
I was just going to add in one thing on the fleet stuff. So one of the things you may have heard from the White House also is this electrification of the federal fleet, and that's there's 3 big parts of the federal fleet, about 250,000 vehicles in each one, military, civilian, and postal. And the General Services Administration does the procurement for the vehicles, and they do a lease program that's about 1/3 of those total vehicles. So they do not currently have authority to allow state and local governments to access that, but it is one of the things that the agency is exploring in their authority. And the other thing to think about in this fleet is that the technology right now for EVs is evolving very quickly. And so the disadvantage of buying your own stuff is it may become obsolete, and you want to be able to keep up with what's changing. So that risk, that obsolescence risk in a lease, goes way down. And that's a key piece of it, as long as, and that economy of scale, as you talked about, not having to deal with the maintenance pieces and the distribution of that. So I know INDOPACOM is talking to GSA as well. So there's conversations around that piece of the federal fleet. And I hope that the state and local piece will work out as well.
And on top of that, Josh, to add to what you just said, it also allows us to cycle cars into the private sector faster as used cars to put them more in reach of lots of people to be able to get them.
Yeah. And as we know, the used car market right now is very, very tough.
Yes.
And there is no used car market really in EVs. And so getting that in there is I think, a great idea.
I would be remiss, though, if I didn't mention VMT reduction, and that we also hope not to just do a total one-for-one swap of all gas cars with electric cars. We do need to control VMT growth. One of the best forms of energy efficiency is walking, bicycling, using mass transportation like buses. And so the more that we can also promote those, it also actually helps with our energy and decarbonization goals.
And one last thing, since we're piling on the EVs, is there's also, a lot of research and some scenario planning around using that new fleet that we created as a way to do storage. And that makes it a lot easier for us to make our other infrastructure investments work. Because what we're doing is we're putting in these batteries and we're parking them all over the place and hooking them up.
Totally agree. Which is why for us the contract, the paying for a service works out the best. We don't have to manage the fleet anymore, but we have a system that we can build with that contract that we're putting in place while we work towards the VMT reductions. We all know VMT reduction is a tough thing. Setting up the last mile for everybody to make sure there's solutions available for them, really important. Making sure that accessibility is part of our culture and no longer a level of service, super important on the adjustment. But those are all adjustments that have to be made. I'm sure everybody on this call has spoken to people who are looking forward to rail being done so that the guy next to them in the next car will start taking rail, right? So making that adjustment in culture is going to take a little bit of time. So making sure that we have emissions reductions through the technologies that we have and the cultures that we can push. As Murray had stated, EVs are part of our culture now. So pushing forward on this is super important for us.
So guys, Murray, go ahead.
I just add really quickly that for the average listener, they're not a state entity that can contract in this way. This mobility is a service that we're talking about, but there's an important lesson to learn from this. The reason why Ed can save lots of money using mobility and EVs as a service, paying per mile effectively, is because the total life cycle costs of EVs are lower than gas cars. So if you include the cost of the vehicle, the maintenance, the fuel, it's cheaper. So understand sometimes the price up front's a bit more, but everyone can benefit from the fact that the total life cycle costs are cheaper. And I just put one last plug in for EVs that after our section is over here, there's going to be an electrification of transportation video. So certainly encourage people to hang around for that.
That was a smooth plug, Murray.
Get in.
So there's, pun intended, there's a lot of energy behind the electrification of transportation. Maybe to just kind of summarize this discussion here so far, a lot of opportunities to electrify the transportation sectors. I think light duty vehicles are sort of the lower hanging fruit opportunities for that. But then I think there's opportunities as we get into the medium and heavy duty vehicles, marine transportation, and even aviation, right? So Scott, when I fly back to Maui to visit my family, I'll be first in line to buy that electric Mokulele airline ticket to get there. But this electrification, this gets to a question that we got from the audience, right? All of this electrification, these opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector by electrifying it is going to require the greater production of electricity. And that electricity, if it's really going to help the transportation sector, needs to either be low or is ultimately zero in carbon. So what are your thoughts about that? The challenges, perhaps the disconnect between sort of one policy driving you towards reducing carbon emissions in one sector, resulting in perhaps a moving target for the electricity sector. What are your thoughts about that? And don't mind the fact that I work for Hawaiian Electric, right? I want to have this discussion around policies and how do we think we can make this work best for our state.
I'll throw one thing out there, Colton. As you know, we worked on the performance-based regulation docket as an intervener, and we did a lot of studying of the electrification of transportation issue and found that even at the current levels of renewables, so even recognizing that presently oil is still a big part of our energy picture in Hawaii, because of the efficiency of EVs, the emissions that you save from not using gas are several times larger than the emissions that you get from the extra electricity. So it's absolutely a win-win still. And as we go to 100%, it only becomes more and more of a win situation. And the last point I'd add is what we'll have to see more of in the future is managed charging, where we try to get folks to charge those vehicles during the time when solar is at its peak.
I think Murray's point is really important, because when we talk about EVs, and I know we've been pushing EVs pretty hard, but they're not a real-time online demand, right? So, there are certain things that if we start electrifying, we're going to be turning on peakers, and we need to be careful about that, because we can go the opposite direction, right? From what we want to do, and it's that outcome measure that we've got to keep focused on. But with things where we can store energy, and that's why it's not just the generation, but it's the storage as well. So we can deal with those issues. I just think we have a great opportunity here. And finally, I think on the opportunity side, this is where we shine as Americans, right? We are really innovative and creative people, and we have an opportunity to create an incredible amount of economic growth, both domestically and internationally, by figuring out new and innovative ways to do this. And we can, one, solve our problem domestically, and two, we can create benefit across the globe. I mean, my flag shirt now.
Yeah.
Very, very, very good point, Josh. Innovation is a strength of Americans in the culture. Maybe not so much managed healthcare, but definitely innovation is something that Americans are pretty darn good at. So I got a question that sort of relates to this, right? That just in the concept of reducing greenhouse gas emissions for economy, right? The economy is also something that's changing, right? And if you look at the last year, we saw this incredible dynamic situation in our tourism economy. But just, I was on Maui last week. You can see tangibly the return of the tourism industry, perhaps to levels that are reaching or even exceeding what we saw March of last year. And tourism being a big part of industry really, and part of the economy is a pretty carbon intensive activity. So sort of as a closing question, since we're running out of time, if I can get your sort of closing thoughts about how perhaps the state's economy at large might want to be looked at and thought about, and how does that play a role in our state achieving its goal?
I'll throw one quick comment in, Colton. I just think that people that come to Hawaii, you got to think about why they come here. They come here, arguably, probably number one is the natural beauty of the environment here. And so anything we can do to protect that environment, it's not only good for the planet, it's good for tourism, it's good for the economy. And people would rather see, sometimes, some neighborhoods are less thrilled about it than others, but, people would rather see a solar farm and a wind farm than they would, and no offense, Colton, an oil-fired power plant. That's what they want to see. They don't want to see, the environment being ruined to a place they're coming to for a clean environment. So it's a very basic statement, but I think that renewable energy and even EVs and all this stuff is fully in line with the expectation that people have when they come to Hawaii.
Awesome. Go ahead, Scott or Josh.
Yeah, I was just going to add to what Murray said and kind of plus one on that. I do think we have an opportunity, because Hawaii is and kind of an island laboratory, that we can demonstrate how these things work. And we need to have more sustainable tourism. At Hawaii Green Growth, one of the things that we were thinking about even pre-COVID was, how do we make that industry more sustainable, because it benefits us? And one of the ways in which we can do that is to bring people who are interested in how we are creating a more sustainable society. And that goes back to a lot of our cultural heritage. So I think that lines up very well.
Yeah, great point. I think we're out of time, folks. Really appreciated all of you participating. It was a great discussion. Hope the folks in the audience watching us virtually enjoyed it as well. Thank you again for being a part of this panel. Thank you for being part of the Hawaii Energy Conference. With that, thank you everyone for joining us, and we will be segueing next into our final stretch for the day. Hang in there. Thank you, guys.